you. I want to start today with a couple of questions. So straight off the bat, we're going to get to some writing. So the first question to contemplate is, well, you're going to finish the end of this sentence. When I consider the condition of our world, I feel that things are getting So when I consider the condition of the world, I feel things are getting And then the second question, again, completing the sentence, one or two or a few words. I feel my ability to improve the situation is I feel my ability to improve the situation is blank. So the jumping off point for today's discussion, or today's topic, is Ahimsa, or Ahimsa, which is translated as non-harming. And it's classified as one of the yamas, one of the restraints. It's probably a review for most of you. And the idea that it falls under one of the yamas, the restraints, implies that there is probably already harm happening, either intentionally or unintentionally, and that harm which is occurring, or that potential for harm, needs to sort of be pulled back or restrained from happening. So the practice starts by noticing the places where we are potentially causing harm, and you can. One way I'm kind of thinking about it the last couple of days is thinking about it in terms of sort of concentric circles, kind of starting from kind of the most obvious, or the most sort of like, am I causing physical harm to other beings? And then kind of working our way inwards and in more subtle ways, reducing the harm through speech, through thought, even coming from like a sort of a depth of like, where does even the motivation to harm sort of percolate up from the unknown source, right? So where's that first sort of even starting before thought, like the pre-thought, right? So you can kind of think of it in concentric circles. And I've been thinking about a lot of concentric circles, as you'll see. And that kind of mimics or echoes the eightfold path anyway, right? We start with like yamas, which are like, don't do harm to other people. The niyamas, like practices for yourself. And then, asana, which is a little bit less, and then a little bit more inwards, and then pranayama and pratyahara, and so on and so forth, kind of moving inwards in these concentric circles. And I think one of the cool things about veganism as a practice of ahimsa is that not only does it cover sort of all of the yamas, right, but you can also sort of you can also sort of use this pattern to look at how I'm reducing my harmful actions towards another. Like, just to use an example, like maybe you just start by like not eating steak, right? And then the next level you sort of stop eating dairy, and then you think, well, I should really reconsider this honey thing. And then you think like, well, you know, even those plastic bags that I take at the grocery store, that comes from oil, and that's causing destruction of, you know, many, many, many animal species on the planet. And so kind of moving in this way, kind of deepening the practice in sort of ever refined circles. And then at some point you want to start to expand. We can't just keep kind of moving inwards. At some point, there's this feeling of expansion that happens. There's a beautiful sutra in the 4th chapter of the Yoga Sutras that describes a farmer working the rice fields, and how in order to sort of flood the fields, you open the gate that has been restraining the water, that has been holding the water back in order to flood the fields and water the rice. And of course that refers to enlightenment and samadhi, but I think in a certain way it can refer to this as well, that image of like over the course of time, the practice of restraint, the practice of pulling back, the practice of going in like that, eventually leads to this sort of flood of creative and proactive energy. Whereas at first we were pulling back, and now we're going forward, right? We're expanding outwards. So instead of just reducing the harm that I'm doing in the world, we want to now reverse it and expand the nourishing, uplifting energy that I'm creating in the world. So there was this moment, I remember the moment that this kind of struck me is many years ago, Sharon Gannon started teaching us about feeding the birds as a way of practicing yoga. And this is why practice is so good, because sometimes you don't understand the full sort of meaning of the practice when it's sort of first introduced to you as an idea, and then over time it like becomes something else. So Sharon says feed the birds, and even though it may not mean feed the birds in every case for every single person, but what it does mean is it means turning that restraint of action into a nourishing action, of doing something that nourishes other beings and nourishes the planet. And I remember hearing that teaching and taking it very much to heart. And if you looked in my backyard now, there are about 6 different bird feeders out there, right? It started with one bird feeder. And I had to figure out like what's the best feed to put out and when and how much and all that stuff. And then I realized that, well, one type of feeder doesn't suit all the birds, so I added another feeder. And then I added another feeder. And then to get the orioles to come, you put orange slices out at a certain time of year because they love eating the orange slices. And so what started as a seemingly simple instruction has, of course, now literally expanded into a smorgasbord for the birds outside. And so that for me was this turning point where my practice turned from just not doing something, keeping myself away from harming, to actually giving something, to nourishing, to expanding the positive action I was doing in the world rather than just reducing the negative action I'm doing in the world. So then, as it happens, there's not only, unfortunately, there's not only a mysterious illness going around amongst the birds currently. So the Audubon Society has advised us bird feeders to pull our feeders back. And unfortunately, bird feeders are one of the ways in which disease can spread through bird populations. So we've had to pull the feeders back. And in doing so, I've been thinking more and more about what it means to feed the birds and how am I going to feed the birds if I can't have the feeders out. And, as I walk around in my neighborhood, there's a certain park that's built up with all native trees, native bushes, native flowers, unlike the other parks, which are like mowed grass and fences and playgrounds and water, more manicured and more purposeful. This one particular park has been allowed to grow in a bit more of a wild way. And I go there to watch the birds because the birds have all that they need in that natural area. They eat the sumac and they eat the seeds off of the top of the flowering grasses, and they get fed, right? They get their nourishment. And so that started me thinking, here I am moving outwards. That got me thinking that maybe the best way to nourish the birds in my backyard might not be through filling feeders with bags of seed, but perhaps by replanting my backyard with the varieties of plants that the birds would usually eat, where they're not houses and parking lots and grocery stores here. So that's led me to this path of wanting to study more and plant more native varieties. Well, then suddenly that has led me to understand that planting more native plants is better for the ecosystem. Native plants have deeper root systems, which helps with drainage and water issues, which we're facing here in Jersey City, which flooded a couple of weeks ago due to the hurricane, the storms from the hurricane. And so suddenly all of my areas of concern, the environment, water, the birds, wildlife, butterflies, all of my areas of concern have kind of tied together and come together in this sort of surprising new way. I don't know why it took me so long, actually, to arrive at this conclusion. And then what's really interesting about that is I started to join some local groups involved in native plantings, and even involved in not only planting their own backyards with native plantings, but also in making attempts to change city regulations to allow for example, street trees to be planted with more native varieties, areas in parks to be devoted to butterfly and bird gardens and natural meadows and things like that. So just in kind of following the practice and in following the sort of footsteps of my literal garden path, I've sort of found myself entering into and getting involved in communities that are devoting their work to this on even municipal, county, even state levels. So that's been That's been the journey, and I shared that in order to hopefully give a sense of how one practice, how taking one small action can lead us in an unexpected but expansive direction. So I'm going to pause there, and I want us to do just a little bit more reflecting, because maybe birds are of no interest to you, maybe native gardening is of no interest to you, and so that's not going to be a very effective entry point for whatever good you're going to do in the world, right? Your activism. So finish the following sentence. My area of most concern is and if you're having trouble answering that question, my advice would be to follow the heartbreak, to follow the pain. When you think of certain areas of the world, or when you think of certain environments, or when you think of certain things that are happening to the planet, what's the thing that hurts? And even feels helpless, right? So acknowledging that which feels painful and that which maybe we feel helpless about at this moment. And then next contemplation, second part, my hope for a future world is, my hope for a future world is and then spend a moment even like feeling that future world. Like if that area of the world that is of concern to you, what would it look or feel like to have that healed? Like visualizing what that future state is. Okay, so the way that I like to think about positive action in the world is also big surprise in concentric circles. Except there's only 3 of them and I forgot my eraser. Okay, so first level is self in the sense of not only self-care, eating enough, sleeping enough, making sure that I have enough sort of energy and state of mind to take action, but then also the motivation aspect and the intention aspect. So how do I keep my intention and motivation going even when I don't feel like taking action, even when I don't feel that my action is going to make any big change, even when I don't feel a sense of hopefulness or feel a sense of being able to do good work in the world, right? So that's the first layer that we're cultivating here. And I use cultivation very specifically because much like gratitude, hope isn't something that it won't work if we consistently rely on external factors. Like if we rely on things going well for us in order to cultivate gratitude, that's not really it. Then we don't have a steady inner sense of gratitude. Same with hopefulness. If we rely on the external world to fill us with hope about the future, it won't work. And we're likely going to be disappointed and demotivated. So, much like many of us are familiar with cultivating gratitude from the sense of an inner motivation, hope also is a practice and something that we cultivate from within, and can't be reliant on, or it's less effective if it's reliant on exterior factors, right? So this whole component is about how we cultivate hope and gratitude even in times of hopelessness, even when it seems like things are really, really, really bad. Then the second layer to think about is about creating personal habits. So that's also self, but it's a little bit more like the atmosphere around self. Right? Self and personal habits. So like thinking of like one thing that I can do to even from far away, even if I live nowhere near an ocean, what's one personal habit or one personal action I can take in my daily life that does affect that area of most concern? So maybe there's something that's already on your list, right? Maybe somewhere in the back of your mind you've been like, oh, you know what? I really need to finally get biodegradable dish sponges instead of getting those plastic sponges all the time. And then do it, right? And then do that action. You know, even here, like I've found that this portion sort of resembles those concentric circles that I put up earlier, which is that, you know, 50 years ago, nobody knew about recycling, nobody recycled, so it was probably a big shift to get people to, for example, separate out the different items of garbage and then to put them out. And here we put them out on different nights, right? I have to put my recycling out on one night and garbage out another night. And you know, I know in Europe they have, you know, you have to take it down and put it in the different bins. But I'm guessing that there was a time when that felt like a huge shift for people, right? And now, of course, not only is putting the bottles in the right compartments more of a habit now, so we don't think about it too much. But also, we've learned that like recycling in and of itself isn't going to be that effective by itself. So now we have to kind of go a little bit deeper with the practice. Well, what about buying less things that come in packages, right? And then challenging ourselves to create new habits around that. well, what about getting rid of paper towels in my kitchen? And then challenging ourselves to recreate that habit. And so at each level, right, it might feel uncomfortable during that first shift, during that first change, but then that new change becomes a habit. It becomes a part of us. So again, that's sort of like ever refining our personal habits. And then the third level is the level of community. What can I bring to my community and to the communities working on my area of most concern? And that, again, that can start with some small actions. For example, joining Facebook groups of people who are also already working on that area of most concern, right? Going to beach cleanups, going to meet other people who share your area of most concern, who maybe are already working on it and maybe already have some knowledge, some resources, some connections, some wisdom that comes with that experience. So making some action to connect with community. And I think this is, I think there's a way in which, okay, actually let me pose this as a question. What stops me? Let's start at the personal level. So just on personal habits. What stops me from taking action on the personal level? Why did it take me 6 months from the time I had the thought of get the biodegradable sponges instead of the plastic ones to actually doing it? I don't know the answer. I'm asking you. So if someone has the answer, please tell me on Sunday. And then second piece, and I think this part is really important, is what stops me from taking action in this realm in terms of taking action with others. So I think this touches on something that I've observed about sort of activism and the way that we even talk about activism, the way we share stories about activism, which is that we tend to share stories that really glorify big individual action, right? We tend to glorify, when I say this, I don't want you to think that I'm diminishing big personal action that people have taken, right? But, for example, Julia Butterfly Hill sat in a redwood tree to prevent loggers from cutting it down. She had support. She had people bringing her food. She had people bringing her supplies. She had people telling her story. She had people communicating. She wasn't. She's the name of who did the action, but really there was a community of support, and then there were even people around the community who may not have been in the community itself supporting in other ways, right? Such as reporters, journalists, other activists, kind of getting the message out. Similar with, any activist name who you can think of, right? Just think of kind of the most famous actions of all time. Gandhi going to get the salt, Rosa Parks on the bus, whoever you can think of, right? The person we remember, of course, we want to honor them and hold them in our hearts, but let's start telling those stories and remembering those stories in terms of the context that they were born out of. There was a context of other actions that many people were taking on many levels. There was a context of people supporting not only those individual people, but other people taking action in the same area. And in the moment that you take action, you don't know if walking to get the salt is going to be the action that shifts things, that shifts the narrative. You don't know it when you begin. You only know it in retrospect. And there were simultaneous sort of other actions from other activists all happening at once as well, right? So the thing to think about in that regard is that alleviates some of the pressure, right? That like my action has to be the one that saves the world. And thank goodness, because who among us can reliably predict what action is going to be the big action? And that also the interpersonal relationships and the community around the action is what's important as well. So taking a moment to also reflect on, and you can write this down, what are my strengths? And it could be anything. What are my strengths? You know, I can lift heavy things, I'm a good communicator. What are my strengths that I could bring to my area of most concern? And what are my resources? What are my resources? Knowledge, money, time, networks. What are my resources that I can bring to my area of most concern? And those two questions might be worth thinking about in more depth over the next couple of days until we meet. And in fact, for many of us, it might be very challenging to write down our strengths. For many of us, it might be a tricky exercise in and of itself to write down our strengths. So maybe take that as something to contemplate before Sunday. And then the last sort of component of it that I want to leave us with is this component of time. That we may not be able to see the results of our own action come to fruition, right? Like Bhagavad Gita, letting go of being attached to the fruits of our action. I think about this a lot when I'm in Prospect Park. Prospect Park is a park in New York City, which is also a very unique park because of its focus on sort of a more naturalness, right? Many parks around the world have a more manicured style, right? Green lawns, mowed, gardens, pathways, more manicured. But Prospect Park has winding paths, lots of native trees and grasses and such, a winding river, much more sort of natural. And when I stand in that park, I think about the original designer of the park. I stand under these, 100-foot trees. I think about the original designers of the park and also the people who worked with those designers to plant the trees and to, make the paths, and everyone who worked on the park. Because those people maybe they planted those trees when they were babies, right? Maybe they cleared an area that was meant to be for native plantings, but they aren't around now to see how the plants have grown in and matured and filled out, and how the trees have grown, and how the red-tailed hawks have made nests in the trees now, and how the wood ducks make nests along the sides of the river, and how the lily pads have filled in around the river along with the algae and all the rest of it. And they aren't around now, right? Because that park was built generations ago. So they didn't see the fruits of their own action, and yet they all took strong action together in the name of sort of a vision of the future that they were creating. So that's another component, is just to think about the time lapse, right? That we may not be able to see the full timeline, but despite the fact that we might not be able to see the whole timeline and how it ends up, what action would we take anyway, regardless of the fact that we can't see the end of the timeline? And that's where I find, a lot of my action falls is like, would I be vegan even if it doesn't save the planet, even if my individual veganism doesn't save the planet? And the answer is yes, because I'm happier and healthier, and it affirms my innermost beliefs. And it makes me happier because I feel more integrity with my values and more alignment with my values. So finding actions that you take anyway, regardless of whether the result comes out or not, or whether you're able to experience the result in your lifetime. I'm going to just end with a quote from Joanna Macy, who wrote a book called Active Hope. Active hope is a practice like Tai Chi or gardening. It is something we do rather than something we have. It is a process we can apply to any situation, and it involves 3 key steps. First, that we take a clear view of reality. Second, we identify what we hope for in terms of the direction we'd like to see things move, or the values we'd like to see expressed. Third, we take steps to move ourselves or our situation in that direction. Since active hope doesn't require our optimism, we can apply it even in areas where we feel hopeless. The guiding impetus is intention. What we choose is the intention we choose, and what we aim to bring about, act for, or express. Rather than weighing our chances, only acting when we feel hopeful, we focus our intention and let that be our guide.